Today's talk is on the Ariyapariyesana Sutta. Did any or every one of you read the article? There's a rather long introduction that I'm not going to read or comment on today. I did on Tuesday's presentation of this. I'm teaching the same sutta Tuesdays and Saturdays for these 2 weeks. There's two parts to it because it's a rather long sutta. And in that introduction, I state that this is one of the most significant suttas in the entire Pali Canon, in that it recounts the Buddha's own search for awakening, and it recounts what he found useful and what he found as simply more distraction, simply what would just further the fabrications in his own mind. And so he abandoned those. So this is the Buddha's recounting on what is a noble search, what leads to awakening, and an ignoble search, which is which would only consider or continue fabricated wrong views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. In this sutta, and I'll read that portion today, it recounts how he studied with two of the foremost spiritual teachers of his time, both teaching variations on the Vedas, which were the modern precursor, or the precursor to modern Hinduism. He mastered those very quickly and rejected them just as quickly because it didn't lead to his goal. And it doesn't delegitimize what they were teaching, or even, now that I mention it, delegitimize the Vedas or modern Hinduism in any way. It simply means that it wasn't what the Buddha was looking for, and it wasn't leading to his awakening. Understanding this sutta, the reason why I call it one of the most significant suttas, understanding this sutta helps us understand why the Buddha taught what he taught and the manner in which he taught, and the reason why he spent nearly as much time teaching what his Dhamma was as teaching what it wasn't, because he understood the condition of a mind rooted in ignorance to grasp at anything that would continue that ignorance, and the ability to ignore its own ignorance by continued eye-making. That's probably the most profound understanding of any human being has ever come to understand the veil of our own ignorance. And you remember in the Nagara Sutta how the Buddha first found himself caught up in this feedback loop of self-identification rooted in wrong views of the three marks of existence, and how it was only when he internally developed right view and all the other aspects of the Eightfold Path rooted in a right meditation practice, they was able to recognize that and extricate himself. So the reference here to ignoble searches is in a general way, and also in a very specific way, to things that we might attach ourselves to and think as valuable in gaining understanding, with what are only fabricated views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. Problem with the phone. The Ariyapariyesana Sutta. On one occasion, the Buddha was in Savatthi at Jita's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. He adjusted his robes, and taking his alms bowl, he left for town for his daily meal. A large group of monks approached Ananda. Everyone knows who Ananda is. Ananda was the Buddha's cousin. He was the Buddha's chief attendant for the last 25 years of his teaching career. And eventually he gained arahantship, awakening. A large group of monks approached Ananda. It has been a long while since we heard a Dhamma talk from the great teacher. It would be for our long-term benefit to hear a Dhamma talk from the awakened one. Venerable ones, perhaps if you went to the hermitage of Ramaka, you will get to listen to a Dhamma talk from the Buddha. We will do as you say, Venerable Ananda. The Buddha returned from alms and asked Ananda to accompany him to the eastern park in the palace of Megara's mother for the day's abiding. Then, having spent the day in seclusion, the Buddha asked Ananda to accompany him to the eastern gatehouse to bathe. Having bathed, Ananda said to his teacher, "The hermitage of Ramaka is nearby. It is pleasant and delightful. There are many there awaiting your teaching. it would be of great benefit to them if, out of sympathy, you were to go there. The Buddha agreed, and they left for Ramaka's hermitage. As they approached, they heard a Dhamma discussion underway. The Buddha waited for the discussion to end. Hearing silence, he cleared his throat and knocked to announce his arrival. Upon entering, he sat on a prepared seat and addressed the Sangha. For what discussion were you all gathered here? Great teacher, we were discussing you, and then you arrived. Good. It is fitting that you have gone from good homes, from good families, from home to homelessness, and you gather for Dhamma discussion. When you gather as a Sangha, you should always discuss the Dhamma or practice noble silence. Those of you that have been on retreat, you understand the importance of that. And also, noble silence relates to a proper meditation practice, in that an internal noble silence is what we develop through right meditation. In other words, we find that we're caught up in our thoughts, that internal conversation. We recognize that and come back to the sensation of breathing. That's an aspect of internal noble silence. Excuse me. The Buddha continues. Friends, there are two types of searching for understanding. There is ignoble searching and noble searching. And what is ignoble searching? Ignoble searching occurs when a person, subject to birth, seeks happiness in what is also subject to birth. That's such a powerful statement that could easily be overlooked and easily misunderstood. Really, what it's an all-encompassing statement, meaning that if we're looking for satisfaction in things that are a part of the impermanent phenomenal world and attaching ourselves to those as a condition for our happiness, such as 3 pieces of chocolate cake as opposed to 2. And I'm being silly, but it could be anything in the phenomenal world. It could be a relationship with a spouse or a child. It could be a desire, such as I'm picking up my new car tomorrow. It could be a desire that a certain political climate be present when it's not. Anything that we attach ourselves that is prone to arising and passing away is what the Buddha is referring to. It's not just a physical birth. And you remember when the Buddha taught for the very first time the Four Noble Truths, and Khandana understood that at such a profound level, and he declared, all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation. And the Buddha said, you are now awakened. You are now Anakandana, the one who understands. That's what the Buddha is referring to. So it's very broad and all-encompassing, but it's also very specific in the way we look at ourselves in relation to the world. It's an aspect of clinging. I'm going to skip over some of my commentary. The Buddha continues, ignoble searching occurs when a person subject to sickness seeks happiness in what is also subject to sickness. And it's not just physical sickness. It's any type of sickness of the mind, any delusion of the mind. Ignoble searching occurs when a person subject to aging seeks happiness in what is also subject to aging. And you know, again, it's all encompassing. Think about the things that we seek happiness in. They're all subject to aging, aren't they? Meaning that they're all impermanent. And the Buddha is not saying that we shouldn't take pleasure in the things of the world. In fact, when we let go of the need to hold on to things or for things to be any different than they are, meaning be any different than impermanent, then we can deeply appreciate every experience as meaningful because we're fully present with it without the need for it to be any different. Is that clear? And that's really what's lying at the core of this teaching here. Ignoble searching occurs when a person subject to death seeks happiness in what is also subject to death. So again, very encompassing, all-encompassing, but also very specific. Seeking happiness in what is, prone to death is also seeking happiness in what is impermanent, isn't it? So in a very broad sense, but a very specific sense, seeking happiness in anything that is impermanent and fabricated from wrong views of Four Noble Truths is an ignoble search. The Buddha discovered this. This isn't a concept that he decided sounded good. It's what he directly experienced. He continues, ignoble searching occurs when a person is subject to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, seeks happiness in what is also subject to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, and delusion. How many times have we been disappointed by things that we attached ourselves to as making us happy and setting a condition that those be present in our lives, and we're only setting ourselves up for disappointment? And they're all rooted in greed, aren't they? Or the other side of that same coin is having an experience that is disappointing, or maybe in an extreme view, very painful. And we create a condition about never wanting to have that experience again. That's another aspect of conditioned thinking. But these things are reoccurring, and they're almost entirely impersonal, meaning we don't have much control over them. But once we set a condition on them, whether it's wanting more of them or less of them, we're setting ourselves up for what the Buddha just described. And so we are establishing the third piece of chocolate cake as an ignoble search. A somewhat silly example, but a more practical example, is setting our understanding, our path to awakening, on something that is itself rooted in a fabrication, not based in reality. And I won't get into.
Example of that last point.
I was just going to say I will get to that. That's what comes up. And if I don't clear it up in this sutta, then please bring it up again. Again, I'm skipping over my commentary. So then the Buddha asks a simple question: what is subject to birth? Spouses and children are subject to birth. Now, of course, the Buddha is not saying we shouldn't have spouses and we shouldn't give birth. But some people will take an extreme view that the Buddha is saying that we should avoid those things because they can bring disappointment. He's not saying that. He's saying that we shouldn't create a condition for our happiness based on things that are subject to impermanence and subject to change. Spouses and children are subject to change all the time, aren't they? And I don't mean just in a physical way. I mean, sometimes relationships are wonderful, and our spouse or our partner or even just someone that we're interested in, they're no longer interested in us. If we base our whole life, our whole attachment, our whole reason for being on them, we're going to be disappointed. Oftentimes, children disappoint us, don't they? When we take that personal, it creates incredible pain for us. When we understand the true nature of not attaching ourselves, not creating a condition in our minds for things to be a certain way, then we are free of the disappointment that follows from that. Buddha continues. Animals of all types are subject to birth. Kind of almost, we would think insignificant, unless you happen to be a dog lover or a cat lover or a goldfish lover. But during the Buddha's time, owning animals was a form of wealth, more so than just having a pet, having a companion. So the Buddha is referring to animals in that sense, but also during the Buddha's time, it was very common that there was animal sacrifices. Gold and silver, meaning material wealth, are subject to birth. So, of course, gold and silver isn't, unless you're getting into physics, gold and silver isn't really subject to birth. But as it comes into and out of our lives, material possessions are subject to arising and passing away, aren't they? That's what the Buddha is referring to. And when we create an identity and a condition for our lives of having the biggest pile or a certain pile of gold or the most coconuts or whatever it might be that we decide we need to qualify ourselves in the world, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. The Buddha continues. And let me just go back. So, and then relating this acquisitory nature that a mind rooted in ignorance has, always trying to acquire things, to establish itself and make itself valuable in its own mind and in the mind of in the view of the world around it. We will also do that in a so-called spiritual search for understanding in many cases. This was very common during the Buddha's time. And it's just as common, if not more common, today. And it really is the biggest distraction that I see, both within and without modern Buddhism. Within modern Buddhism, there is this establishment of lineages that don't really go back to the Buddha, go back to a charismatic teacher. And we attach ourselves to that particular lineage, create an identity. And that then becomes the focus of our so-called Buddhist practice, when the ignoble search part of that is that the teachings themselves are rooted in ignorance of what the Buddha taught. It doesn't delegitimize the teachings themselves, but it's an ignoble search if those teachings are based on fabrications rather than what the Buddha actually taught. And that's very, very common in modern Buddhism. And the Buddha is teaching this because he went through the same thing just as I did. I studied in all the major modern Buddhist schools. None of them led to, an understanding. They all led to to more an ever-increasing confusion and frustration. And much like the Buddha, when I finally put those aside and studied just what the Buddha taught, then it made sense. And again, it doesn't delegitimize those other practices. They're simply not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha continues, when these are seen as acquisitions, one becomes attached and infatuated with these acquisitions, seeking happiness in that which is When these are seen as acquisitions, one becomes attached and infatuated with these acquisitions. Seeking happiness in what is subject to birth is an ignoble search. So again, very simply, what seeking happiness is anything that is impermanent or fabricated from a wrong view, meaning it is also impermanent, is subject to stress, to suffering, to dukkha. I'm going to read my comments here. Identifying anything as me or mine, or joining with by clinging to any object, event, thought, or idea is an acquisition. Wishing for permanence in what is inherently impermanent is rooted in craving, aversion, and deluded thinking, the three defilements that arise from ignorance of the three marks of existence. The Buddha continues, likewise, these are all subject to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, despair, greed, to aversion, to delusion. I'm going to go back to that again, just to relate it to my own experience in the Buddhas. In seeking, there was regret in the Buddha's seeking, because he found things that were presented to him as the highest teachings. He put his time in and ultimately regretted that decision as it's not leading to his goal. So he realized that seeking happiness in those things that are prone to this whole long list of things is simply an ignoble search. And there's not a moral or an ethical equivalency here. In other words, it's not saying that if you find something and you later discover that it's part of an ignoble search, it doesn't mean that the practice is bad or mean or evil, or the person that's teaching it is somehow to be denigrated. In fact, I'll make a point of how the Buddha treated his teachers, even though you could say that they misled him. It's simply a recognition that that's not a belief system or a teaching that leads itself to understanding, period.
So just to clarify that, an ignoble search is one that is distracted from awakening. Sort of, it's like,
yes,
it's moving towards more ignorant rather than awakening.
Yes, it's simply more distraction. It's it's an establishment of a self that no matter how useful it might seem, if it's rooted in any of these qualities that the Buddha is teaching here, and there'll be some more coming up, it's an ignoble search. And the important thing there is to recognize, okay, this is what this is. Let me just end it right now.
Right.
Instead of spending endless lifetimes, if I continued in some of the Buddhist schools that I was a part of for many years, it was taught that this is a practice that you likely will never awaken to, but if you put endless lifetimes into it, eventually you will. So you create, that's much of modern Buddhism is presented that way. So if you accept a condition, You are placing the condition in your own mind that, okay, this is what I'm going to do for endless eons, with the hope that at some point I might understand, I might gain awakening. And even that is not clearly defined except by the Buddha. He clearly defines what awakening is. It's profound right view. It's understanding stress. It's abandoning the origination and the continuation of stress, craving and clinging. It's having the experience of that cessation, and it's fully developing the Eightfold Path. Nothing ambiguous about it. Let me go back to that again. Likewise, these are all subject to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion. Seeking happiness with what is subject to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, is ignoble searching. That greed comes in very strongly when I find myself associating with a group of people that are themselves stuck in wrong views, but infatuated with that, enthusiastic about that. And because of my association, I fall into that same infatuation. I did that. I did, in fact, many times. I took great infatuation, and in fact, I even took vows in a certain Tibetan school because I was so infatuated with the teachings and infatuated with the associations I made. And the same thing basically occurred when I went to, I don't want to keep putting things down because it sounds like that, to another modern Buddhist practice. And it was because of my association that made it very, very difficult to put that aside, even when I realized that this was part of an ignoble search. One of the underlying themes of the Buddhist teaching is to be mindful of who and what you associate with, because who and what you associate with, to a large extent, will determine what your experience is. And I should say that's most important in your Dhamma practice. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have friends with people that aren't practicing the Dhamma and nobody else. That's foolish. Now the Buddha gets to the good stuff. And what is noble searching? Noble searching is, while being subject to birth, seeking to understand the suffering of birth, seeking the unborn, the unexcelled release of the yoke, the unbinding. The yoke meaning being bound to views ignorant of Four Noble Truths, being bound to wrong views. This is noble searching. While being subject to birth is another important line here, because what the Buddha is saying is that this Dhamma is effective even while you're rooted in ignorance. In fact, it's designed that way. That's why there's an Eightfold Path. It's not just an awakened human being saying, you're wrong, just think this way, because he understands the nature of ignorance. So the Eightfold Path meets us at our own level of ignorance and guides us out of that. Noble searching is, while being subject to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, seeking what is free of sickness, of aging, of death, free of sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, free of greed, aversion, and delusion. This is noble searching. Again, meeting us where we are. We begin our Dhamma practice wherever we are, without any special dispensation from a charismatic teacher, without any intervention by, and again, this is one of the reasons why the Buddha is teaching this, is it was spiritual understanding, even during the Buddhist time, was often taught as a gift bestowed by gods and higher level devas, provided you did the right things, usually certain rituals. Still very common today. The school that I took my vows in, once you take your vows, if you want to then begin formal practice, formal Dhamma training, you first must perform 108,000 complete prostrations, meaning from a standing position, you lay down on the floor, touch your head, come up, stand up, put your hands up, or maybe do this, depends on who your teacher is, 108,000 times before you can even begin training. That's what the Buddha is referring to in one sense right here. There's none of that necessary. What you need to do is to start developing the Eightfold Path. That is ignoble searching. Noble searching is seeking the unexcelled release of the yoke, the unbinding. This is noble searching, meaning a noble search is seeking understanding of Four Noble Truths. I just mentioned this, but let me say this. This is my comment. Unbinding from views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths is awakened right view, as described by the Buddha. Awakened right view is understanding stress or understanding suffering, understanding the origination of suffering, understanding the cessation of suffering, and understanding the path leading to the cessation of suffering. You see how that relates directly to the Four Noble Truths. Now, the Buddha says, friends, before my self-awakening, it's an important line. The Buddha taught us to do exactly what he did, self-awaken. When I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, another important little phrase here. Most of modern Buddhism, and again, I'm not putting it down, I'm making the distinction. Most of modern Buddhism is based on the Mahayana view, which is the bodhisattva path. That's how it's described. And the bodhisattva path is described one of two ways. Is I seek awakening for myself so that all other sentient beings can follow from that. Notice how that is a contradiction of the First Noble Truth. Or even more debilitating in my mind, but it's the vow that I took and quickly disavowed, I delay my own awakening until all sentient beings awaken with me. And then there's even a further view that's part of that, that when the Buddha awakened, all beings awakened, but we just don't know it yet. It's something the Buddha didn't teach. And how practical would that be? So the Buddha is using that word, an unawakened bodhisattva, and he uses this many, many times throughout his teaching career to describe himself as an incredibly and profoundly compassionate human being, but lacking the wisdom of actually being helpful to other human beings. And that describes most human beings, doesn't it? We all wish to be helpful towards others. We had a really wonderful discussion about engaged Buddhism Tuesday night, led by a question that David brought up, but referring to something that you brought up a while ago, Mary, about what do I do off my cushion? There's so much going on in the world that it almost seems selfish, or maybe keeping our heads in the sand because of all the difficulty in the world. And here I am with this practice of a refuge. And the discussion was really wonderful. But this is something that the Buddha went through too. When he left his home as one of the wealthiest people in his part of India. He was in a position of great power, and he understood the suffering in the world around him, at least at a surface level. He was in a position to do a lot of good for people. But he also understood, at least at a intuitive level, that he was lacking understanding. There was something missing. And so that's what led him out to start seeking. And I'm sure along the way, during his 6 years of seeking, he helped people. But he did not develop a Dhamma of being engaged in the world until he awakened. And until that point, he could always refer to himself as an unawakened bodhisattva. And so the discussion and the things that I often talk about, and the phrase that I often use, is the most loving thing that I can do for myself and for all other sentient beings as a compassionate human being, as a bodhisattva, is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. Because then, once I free my mind of the conflict that's present, rooted in ignorance, I can be much more effective and in the world around me. And I know that I will no longer contribute to the suffering in the world based on my own confusion or reaction to what's occurring in the world. Is that clear? It's such an important point, and it's one of the, I don't know if I use the word disappointment, but I guess I will because it fits with dukkha. And the modern Buddhism now has, especially in the West, has accommodated itself to the point where it's mostly just engaged Buddhism, meaning people that would otherwise might develop a more extensive Buddhist practice, take that bodhisattva view, that the charge that I am the bodhisattva path, and that path means that I should be compassionate to all sentient beings, but lacking the wisdom, and usually that results into taking a position that against something or someone or a series of beliefs. And so that so-called engaged enlightened Buddhism is now rooted in aversion against someone else, and it simply creates more conflict. So there's a way of recognizing that some things are more skillful in the world, but when we start attaching hatred towards an idea or a person, we're rooted in wrong view, aren't we? And we can create more conflict in the world because of that underlying conflict in our own mind. The seeming paradox, but it really isn't, we may have the same position as an awakened human being that we had when we were unawakened, meaning we might promote certain ideals, but there won't be any antagonism or aversion or hatred in that. Our minds will be free of conflict, so we won't be contributing to conflict. And again, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things that are helpful. I don't want to go too much further than that, but because it is slightly getting off the topic. But it relates to the importance of developing understanding if we want to be truly helpful in the world. The most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for all others is to take to the Dhamma and awakening. The Buddha, I'll go right back to that one line. Friends, before my self-awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, being subject to birth, to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, I was seeking happiness in what is subject to birth, to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion. My comment. I just really said that. I'm going to skip over that. Then the thought occurred to me, why do I, being subject myself to birth, to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, seek what is likewise subject to those things? I won't read that whole list again and again and again. So think about that. He finally he's coming to realize what an ignoble search is. Searching in what is giving me the confusion, delusion, and is continually directing me in a way that is prone to those things. How foolish is it to seek happiness in those things? A good example is that of an addict, and I'm talking from personal experience. I kept trying to find happiness at the bottom of a vodka bottle because at one time, a million years before, I did for a brief instant. That's the nature of addiction, isn't it? It's the nature of any type of compulsive behavior once it rises to the level of compulsion, because we're now trying to recreate something that at one time, in one instant, provided satisfaction, but it was fleeting because it's impermanent. It's part of the 3 marks of existence. And yet, because we were so conditioned by that one experience, we keep seeking happiness in that same exact or a corollary experience. And what I'm saying is, and this is common for many people that are compulsive, they deal with one compulsion, say alcohol, and they might substitute drugs. Or it might be sex and we substitute shopping. Or it might be too much work and we substitute too much golf. But we always find something to continue the distraction, because we're looking to recreate that. We're trying to establish permanence in a state of mind that cannot hold that permanence. All things are impermanent.
But John, with addiction, there's more than just, there's a physiological reason for it.
Yes, and that the physical addict has a much more difficult time dealing with it, but the underlying thought process is basically the same as compulsion, and even rising to the level of compulsive behavior that's not addicted to substances, such as other things.
But it still has to do with brain chemistry, not necessarily. You're releasing dopamine, and it's making you happy.
Yes, and they still haven't proven. I really think that it's the thought process, and the drinking or drugging that changes your chemistry, resulting into physical addiction. And they haven't been able to figure that out. I think that's more likely. But even if it isn't, so there's a physical my whole family has the same genes. Some of them ended up with full-blown addiction like I did. Some of them went to different types of slightly compulsive behaviors, but didn't end up like me, just to put it that way. So the physiological chemistry is the same, but there's something else. There's a component of that is different, that causes someone like me to end up where I did, and my brother, some of my brothers are like me, to not. So again, there's a chicken and an egg thing. But even if actually where I was going with that is I really believe that my father, who's just turned 100 years old, I believe that he is an addict because he has the entire personality of an addict, and I won't get into that. But he only got drunk twice in his life that I noticed. And it was when in a social situation, he had one drink and it led to him getting drunk, but he was so embarrassed by it. And because his father was a fall down drunk, he created this great aversion that I think kept him sober. But he was physiologically, I think, prone to addiction. I think if he kept having a few more drinks, he probably would have ended like that. So, but you bring up a good point. But compulsion is something different. I was married to a food addict, and maybe they'll find that there's some physiological reason for that. But her addiction was exactly the same as mine. In other words, I come home from a couple of days on the road and I'd find, food hidden behind the couch, et cetera, exactly the same thing. So the point of seeking happiness or seeking fulfillment or enlightenment in what is subject to these things is simply an ignoble search, but something that a mind rooted in ignorance will quickly grasp onto as reasonable, not necessarily something addictive. What if I, being subject to birth, were to seek to understand the suffering of birth, seeking the unborn, the unexcelled release of the yoke, the unbinding, rather than immerse yourself in what the problem is, to seek an understanding of the problem? And again, on a practical level, you can say that that's what recovery from addiction is truly based on, to some people anyway. And just to clarify this, the reference to the unborn or the deathless state, the Buddha is not talking about immortality. What he's really talking about, and this is the title of the book, Becoming Buddha, and the teachings on what becoming means. What am I holding in mind that will give birth to the next moment? If I'm holding in mind the principles of the Eightfold Path, then I will cease giving birth to another moment rooting in ignorance. Ignorance has become unborn in my mind. What if I, being subject to sickness, to aging, to death, to sorrow, regret, pain, distress, despair, to greed, to aversion, to delusion, were to seek understanding of the suffering of those things? What if I were to seek the unborn, the unexcelled release of the yoke of unbinding from those things? In other words, instead of focusing on them, which is another way of attaching ourselves to them, there's a whole other school of Buddhism that talks about embracing our suffering. One famous world teacher always talks about embracing your suffering. That's just another word for joining with your suffering or clinging to your suffering. The Buddha didn't teach us to embrace our suffering. He taught us to understand it. Why? So we can simply let it go. So at a later time, the Buddha is now describing what set him off now on his noble search. At a later time, while still a young man, black-haired, early in my life, my parents crying, I shaved off my hair, put on a robe made of rags, and went forth from home to homelessness. Having gone forth, seeking understanding of these things, seeking what is skillful, seeking unexcelled and lasting peace, I first went to, this is a very shortened summary of what he went through, but these are the important points. Seeking unexcelled and lasting peace, I went to Alara Kalama, one of the most famous teachers during the Buddha's time. On arrival, I said to him, friend Alara, I want to practice your Dharma. And I'm using the word Dharma here to differentiate between a spiritual teaching as opposed to what the Buddha taught, Dhamma, just to not get them confused, Dharma and Dhamma. And I do that when I refer to modern Buddhism as Dharma and what the Buddha taught as Dhamma. I want to practice your Dharma and discipline to become your disciple. Alara said to me, you may stay. My Dharma is such that an observant person can soon understand and integrate my knowledge and realize it for themselves through their own direct knowledge. From reciting and repetition, I quickly learned his Dharma. I could affirm that I knew his Dharma. I thought that it is not through mere conviction that Alara Kalama declares that I understand and have integrated his Dharma and realize it for myself through direct knowledge. Alara Kalama certainly understands and has integrated his Dharma. The difference there is it's not just an intellectual learning. You have to integrate this. So I went to Alara and asked him, what is the culmination of your understanding and integration of this Dharma? Alara declared that the culmination of his Dharma was establishment in the dimension of nothingness. So this is a reference that we went through this when we were talking about the different levels of jhana. It was a common teaching during the Buddha's time that advanced meditation levels were establishing yourself in the dimension of nothingness. Still taught today, the dimension of emptiness, the dimension of infinite consciousness or infinite space, or the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, that these were all things to seek to acquire and establish yourself in. The Buddha realized after studying with Alara Kalama, and I'll relate his teaching with his studying with Udaka Ramaputta in a second, that these imaginary mind states were just simply another fabricated state of mind rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And he gave no credence to these. In other words, they're not even to be seen as something advanced in our meditation practice. You remember the teachings on jhana. They're just to be recognized as fabricated states. So even in our meditation practice, if we find ourselves established in a non-physical realm and try to identify it and it feels pleasant, and we seek to establish ourselves, you can see there that it's rooted in craving and clinging, isn't it? It's just a fabricated mind state. Meditation is for deepening concentration, period. And so anytime we find ourselves in a fabricated mind state in a non-physical realm, we know that it's fabricated and it's not rooted in concentration. Then I had the thought, not only does Alara Kalama have conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment, I also have conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. What if I were to strive to realize for myself the Dharma through direct knowledge? I quickly developed understanding and fully integrated Alara Kalama's Dharma, having realized for myself the dimension of nothingness through direct knowledge. I then asked Alara if this was the culmination of his understanding and integration of this Dharma. Alara told me that this the culmination of his understanding and integration of his Dharma. He then said that it was a great gain for his Sangha to have a companion such as myself in their Sangha. He then asked me to lead their Sangha together. Alara Kalama, my teacher, placed me on the same level as himself, paying me great honor. But I had the thought that this Dharma does not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, or to unbinding. This Dharma only seeks to establish a reappearance in the dimension of nothingness. The Buddha understood very clearly that Alara Kalama's Dharma, he was set up as one of the foremost teachers of his time. It was a great honor to be asked to be on the same level as him and be one of his teachers. But the Buddha also realized that wasn't what he wasn't seeking power or fame or finding a group that he could be important in. He was seeking understanding. And when he understood that the culmination of his teachings was simply the establishment in another fabricated mind state, and even worse, teaching that to others, he declined. I found this Dharma unsatisfactory, and so I left Alara Kalama and continued the noble search. I'm going to stop here because it's 10 minutes to 10. The next direct reference is to Udaka Ramaputta, who the Buddha had the same experience with. The Buddha quickly integrated this practice, And Udaka Ramaputta asked the Buddha the same thing. Would you come and join us? Join me? Be my equal? The Buddha asked the same question, or actually still Siddhartha then, he's not awakened yet. he said, where does your practice culminate in? In the perception of neither perception nor non-perception. That's a common teaching today too, by the way. And the Buddha says, no, that's just another fabricated state of mind, another fabricated mind state rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, and he went on his way. Now, to get to Anthony's question, what was that?
I don't remember exactly the part you read, but it's something to do with getting too absorbed in spiritual practice.
Yes. So, that's the first half of this, and I'll continue this. The second half is where the Buddha recounts other practices and then his encounter with the 5 friends that he was wandering around northern India with. So there's a lot of, I'm going to use the word spiritual with the quotes around. A lot of spiritual practices are very useful. The most useful modern spiritual practices quickly allow us to establish ourselves in the practice itself, and it feels good, and it feels like there's a focus. And again, I'm talking from my own experience, but now I'm also referring to the Buddha's experience here with those 2 teachers. It feels like we're doing something. It feels like we're accomplishing something. But really what we found is another way to distract ourselves. And so since our minds are distracted and we're no longer regurgitating views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths and having that cause reactions in our mind, it feels like we found something. And in reality, we may have that's useful in making us feel good, and it might even make us better people. The principles surrounding yoga, if you just develop them, it'll make you a better human being, won't they? And I'm not putting down yoga, but it's simply a different practice. There's nothing within the modern yoga practice that leads to the same thing that the Buddha teaches. So it can become a very powerful but subtle distraction. Modern meditation practices that are really more contemplation, or the feeling of conjuring up bliss and making that your meditation practice, or focusing on a candle or an image, these can all lead to a pleasant distraction, but none of them will help deepen concentration, and so they're not part of an Eightfold Path. So does that answer your question? So another way of saying it is, just because something feels good or a lot of people are doing it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a practice that the Buddha taught. We're all free to do that and develop these other things. But I will say, and I didn't understand I didn't understand the significance of my own search until I read this sutta. And I realized that I really went through the same thing that the Buddha did, but almost everybody in the world today does. We're seeking happiness in things, whether it's through a spiritual search that only reinforces fabricated views, or a worldly search, just seeking happiness in material things or power or position. It's all kind of the same thing.
So it's because then it doesn't include the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path.
Well, yes, but even that has to be pretty cautious, because some modern practices will mention the Four Noble Truths, but almost as an aspect of the Buddha's teaching, like he taught this. They might even say, well, the Eightfold Path is this, without presenting it as the path and as the entire framework of the Buddha's teaching. That's why I say so often, everything the Buddha taught was taught in the context of Four Noble Truths, not as the Four Noble Truths is something along the lines of something else. And all of that is rooted in dependent origination, which states from ignorance of Four Noble Truths, all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing suffering arises. The reason why I'm saying that now is really an answer to your question. I have yet to come across a modern Buddhist school that does not embellish or completely alter dependent origination. And if you could all go online and do a search on, I won't mention any names, but pick a famous modern teacher and do a search on that name, dependent origination. You'll be surprised what they're teaching and relate it to dependent origination. Again, I'm not putting them down, and there's a reason for that. These teachings have had to be adapted in order to qualify what would follow, which are something that makes people very distracted and feels very good. When I was a part of these different schools, I had a strong identity by being this type of Buddhist or in this other different school. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was also very prideful. And now I am so-and-so Buddhist. When the fact of the matter was that even the identity was a distraction to me. And so I strived very hard to do what they told me to do as Buddhist practice, even though I felt that it was wrong. There was no possible value. One of the schools was something that did a lot of chanting, and I never liked chanting because I didn't understand it, especially when it was in a foreign language. And how can this be of any value to me? And I was taught, well, there's vibrations in the words that change the way your physiological makeup and your thinking. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And in doing it, I'd stand there for hours. I know about doing these chants with everybody else around me, and I felt good on one hand because I was part of this large group, but on the other hand, I felt completely foolish. Why am I doing this? And so there was this underlying tension. But I think that answers your question, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, we can easily get distracted. And really, that's the reason why I'm teaching this. The Buddha found that same thing during his time. It was so easy to establish yourself and associate with yourself with something that was simply more distraction. And so he taught an eightfold path as a way to guide ourselves from a mind that's prone towards distraction and keep us well focused within the Dhamma. I'll teach the second half of this next Saturday and also next Tuesday too. Excuse me. Is there any questions related directly to this teaching? And we'll just go around the room. And also, I'd really like to hear if you find, and it's okay to say you don't find any value, but do you find value in this particular sutta? And again, it's okay to say you don't. Anthony, good to see you.
Good morning, everyone. I find value in it. It reinforces the importance of not clinging and craving and understanding that things are impermanent. The other thing I was thinking of with spiritual teachers is sometimes it's really easy to confuse the fall in love with the pointer and not what they're pointing at.
Yeah, that's so common.
Spiritual leaders, and sometimes they take advantage of that. Somebody just wrote a whole book about how certain spiritual leaders could be very, dead on in their teachings, but be terrible people.
Yeah,
personally.
Yeah, and I would argue with that.
People.
I would argue with that. I don't think you could be a terrible person to be dead on in your teachings. I think, in fact, that's an article that I'll be publishing as soon as I get it done. It doesn't make sense that you could be a sexual predator and teach something that is valuable, because obviously there's something lacking if the teacher himself couldn't take benefit from his own teaching. It doesn't mean that everybody that follows that teaching will end up as just as an example, a sexual predator. But there's got to be something lacking in the teaching itself that would allow a teacher who has all the knowledge of the teaching, to end up in that behavior. That, to me, the proof is in the pudding. Can you imagine that we would even be talking about Buddhism today if the Buddha was a sexual predator? It wouldn't have gotten out of northern India. He likely back then he probably would have been put to death. But I don't see, and I realize that I'm, take this into some of the modern Christian teachings. To me, to have thousands of bishops doing what they're doing, there's something basically lacking in that teaching that allows you to be that way. I don't want to get into it.
It's lacking in your understanding of your own teaching.
Well, but how could again, people that have advanced in that teaching be so prone to the three defilements of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking? And then taking it back to, there's not a modern Buddhist lineage that does not have a charismatic sexual predator in their lineage. Not one. And this is all now just coming out, but I've known about it for years because I was in those different schools. And it's all been covered up, just like it has been in Christianity. To me, the reason for that is there's something lacking in the Dhamma that allows for continued greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. And that's because it's not rooted in dependent origination and Four Noble Truths. So and if I can make the point, and I wish I could, I wish I had a large enough platform to make the point that take a look at your teaching, because if it can lead to this in your teacher, there's got to be something missing there. Why would you continue with it?
Yeah, I don't know. I could see it the other way, because I think that just that that you be a brilliant teacher but not be a very good role model.
Yeah, but again,
It's the same thing with the Me Too movement. There's a big debate on whether we should still appreciate the art of people who are terrible people.
well, yeah, that's there's a fine line there, because you get into supporting people financially by going. I'll talk about Weinstein and going to his films if he was still even in business. I guess he's not. I think I'd have a hard time just supporting him in that way by buying his stuff. There's a sexual predator who got caught within his Sangha. I won't say what it is, but he left the country. He established himself in a extradition-free country, and his worldwide organization is still taking funds and sending them to him. This guy is 90 years old. I can't think of anything more hurtful towards people than covering it up. And he never admitted it either, by the way. He never, and everybody knows it. I was part of a few sanghas that were like that. Not sanghas, organizations. And again, I don't want to get into beating up individuals, but I quickly realized this one teacher, his students still marvel. He's dead now. He died at 54 from alcoholism. They marveled at his ability to give Dharma talks while he was completely drunk.
Yeah,
I thought it was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. And that, again, he's still talked about in those marvelous terms. He was so advanced that he could give a Dharma talk drunk. And that's one of the things that got me looking at, and this is still a worldwide, that's one of the things that got me looking at, maybe there's something missing here. And do I really want to practice this form of Buddhism?
You should write that article. I'd love to.
I am, but it's hard to, the difficulty I'm really having, and I've been writing it for about a year and a half, is I don't want it to sound hateful. I don't want it to sound like I'm saying these people are evil. And it's very hard to do that, to say that somebody is hurtful without also classifying them as evil, because our minds want to go there. We do that with leaders today. They might just be bad people. They're evil. Well, they're not. They're deluded. I'm sorry, Mary.
He who shall not be named.
Yeah, because I find myself doing that more and more often. But it's just, it really is unfortunate. And I know that your view that the underlying teaching can still be valid, even though the teacher is so deluded, is the common view. And I understand that my view is very contradictory to that, but that's what makes sense to me, that if you're teaching something that could allow you to act in a certain way, there's something missing. And what is missing is that it's a teaching that is different than what the Buddha taught. That's all. I don't want to keep going on. This is another subject, but are you finished today?
Yeah, no, I'm done.
I'm glad you're here. And thank you for bringing that up. Jen, good to see you.
Good to see you. There was something that you said, I just want to restate it and make sure that I got it right. It's seek happiness in things that are not subject to the list of things that you...
Sickness, aging, death,
Right.
sorrow, regret, pain.
So that kind of blew my mind when you said that, because I was like...
Because there's nothing left, huh?
Seeking something? Like, I'm still seeking? There's still something to seek there?
Well, that's the
I guess
view.
I'm very much seeking, like, to me, seeking means, like, grasping.
Yeah. Well, it is.
Right? So, but there's still things to seek?
Question.
Well, if you're going to seek anything, seek understanding, and that's a very well-defined path.
Seek an understanding of... I just feel like that also might cause a lot more.
Well, the Buddha says that right here. He said when I was at one time I was seeking happiness in those things, sickness, aging, death, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And then when I put my focus on the noble search and I started seeking happiness where it can be found, voila, I found it. And how do we know we're doing it? an Eightfold Path. And again, we only went through half this sutta. And the meaningful words there are also seeking happiness in. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take pleasure in. In fact, we should. The Buddha, this is one of those things that it's kind of a fine
Seeking
line.
versus taking. It's like seeking is it's, to me, that means you're doing it when you're not doing it. Like you're thinking about it.
Well, but it also could be engaged in the activity, and even while we're engaged in it, it's not enough, and the activity is over, and whatever it might be, could be eating something. It could,
Right.
But when the motivation to engage in anything is so that thing or the event or the person provide me something that I don't have right now, meaning happiness or satisfaction, however we want to put it. That's seeking happiness in those things. In another simplified way, is seeking happiness in anything that is impermanent is prone to suffering. But it does not mean that because those things are prone to suffering that we should just isolate ourselves from the world. That's a form of asceticism that is related to those things that the Buddhists studied with. Those establishment of the self in realms, imaginary realms, is a subtle form of asceticism that I won't get into if it's not obvious, but it is. That the Buddha studied and rejected. He studied physical asceticism too, denying yourself everything, thinking that will free your mind from your body. Well, the Buddha wasn't trying to free his mind from his body. He was trying to find a way to be mindfully present, moment by moment, in life as life occurs. And in that way, every single thing that occurs is meaningful. And you could say pleasant because we don't need it to be any different. And even unpleasant things. That's the last mention, the last guidance in meditation is notice the quality of your mind, be at peace with your mind. That's a reference to the fourth foundation of mindfulness. So no matter what's occurring, an awakened mind is at peace, even though what's occurring might be less than peaceful. Is that clear?
So basically, it's just recognize that if you're seeking something or you're seeking happiness in something that's permanent, then just let it go.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean to not take
Take
meaningful pleasure.
Avoid that thing either.
Not at all. In fact, that's a version, isn't it?
Right.
It means to be fully present and maybe just to use the word appreciative of what's occurring. And then say a one-on-one relationship to be very, I don't want to go on too long, but years and years ago, I had a teacher named Arnold Patton. I think he's still alive. And he taught these workshops called Universal Principles Workshop that had a lot of a lot of Buddhist teachings in it, but not completely. The point that I'm making is him and his wife were married at that time. I think he celebrated his 50th anniversary while I was still seeing him. And she would always be around while he was giving these workshops, but hardly ever participated. Once in a while, she'd give a poem. She'd read a poem in a workshop. But you could see, just by looking at these two people, that they were so incredibly in love with each other. They didn't have to say anything. You just knew it. And then when they conversed with each other, you could this incredible connection that they had. And he used that as a teaching tool. He made the point that his wife's name was Selma, that him and Selma every day this wasn't a verbal thing, but every day they recommitted to be in each other's lives. In other words, it wasn't a contract hanging over them that they stayed together. They stayed together because they wanted to be with each other. Period. Isn't that remarkable? I got to get a hold of Arnold and see if he's here. So again, the point is, it initially sounds like annihilation or we shouldn't enjoy our life. It really is just the opposite. It's a way of enjoying our lives completely without the need for it to be any different. It also means that we will suffer loss in our life, but we will not have to need it. We won't need it to be any different. There's no aversion to the loss. It's simply a recognition and maybe even a deeper appreciation of what was there. You see? Mm-hmm. And that's what the Buddha's teaching. When the Buddha heard his dad was dying, he didn't, I'm going to go meditate. He got up from under his tree and walked 140 miles in the sweltering heat to be with his dad before he passed. Not out of any clinging or craving, simply because it was the mindful thing to do. So you bring up a great point. Seeking happiness is the problem. being happy is the solution when we stop seeking. Thank you. Mary, it's good to see you today.
Good to be here. I think this teaching is very profound, but in my mind, it brings to mind that there is a lot of physiology that goes into addiction, craving, clinging, whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
But I can see that if you can train your mind not to always seek the thing that's going to release more dopamine, be basically with a less than peaceful mind state. But I think some individuals can do it. I think genetics plays into a big part, unfortunately, for those who can't do it.
Well, I think so, but I know from my own experience, obviously, that no matter how genetically wired you are towards addiction, you can change your mind about it, which is really what it is. I mean, recovery really is ultimately, there's a time when you need to be separated, physically used for most people. But ultimately, the reason why I don't drink or take drugs today is because I've changed my mind about it, really. Literally. Yeah. And so the physiology is, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that if I started drinking today, I would fall right back into it because I believe that I'm physiologically different. But there's no loss there. I don't feel like oh, geez, I wish I could go have once in a while. When I hear certain people give a speech, just kidding. No, I am. I really am kidding. I'm making a joke.
The truth of the matter is you don't follow through on it and you don't allow the discomfort of what you see going on out there to push you to doing something unskillful.
Yes, and I've gone through, like every human being, I've gone through some terrible tragedies without ever thinking of taking a drink or a drug again. And so to get back to what you're saying, being physiologically wired towards addiction, that aspect that would have me immediately reach for a drink is no longer there. So something has changed within me, hasn't it? And I think that, and they're starting to find different areas of the pleasure parts of the brain that are stimulated that are stimulated in people not just prone to addiction, but just about anything. We can create that dopamine response, and it could be, and they've even said this, it could even be just a pleasant visual in our own minds, and we release that. So the Buddha, I was just reading and talking to Ram a little earlier. I was reading Stephen Hawking's last book that they just published after his death. And the similarities, and I don't think he ever studied Buddhism, but the similarities between the conclusions that he's making about the universe and where it came from and where it's going, and even the nature of God, are so similar to what the Buddha taught. The Buddha is often taught is even given the appellation as the great physicist, the great physician. I think a better description would be the great physicist, because he understood these things that this other great mind is teaching. And so I think on a physiological level, and again, they're starting to understand this, that a right meditation practice within the Eightfold Path obviously has an internal effect on us. And we feel it, don't we? Off our cushions, we are more calm. Isn't that a physiological effect?
Oh, no, it is,
Yeah. And so thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's so important. I use addiction because it's personal, and it's also an extreme way of making a point. But we all are, the problem of addiction, if you can call it clinging or attachment, is the common human problem, isn't it? We're addicted to our own views. That's another way of saying we create these powerful strategies to continue to ignore our own ignorance because we're addicted to it. We don't want to see it because it's all that we know. And so we find other things to become addicted to or clinging to, meaning it might be a spiritual practice or an idea or a deva that we worship or anything else. And the danger in that is that it can lead to very charismatic people that are teaching something that they're holding out as useful when there's something severely lacking in it. And I don't want to go get it. When the article comes out, you'll see more about it. So thank you, Marian. Kevin, good to see you.
Yeah, I think this is an extremely valuable teaching. I think it's so interesting that in the Buddha's own words that he talks about his spiritual search, and I think it mirrors our own search. and that, you came to the middle way, the path, and he brings that path, and it just reiterates what it is.
Yeah.
So we can follow that.
Yeah, and we know this is the. I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'll get into more of this next week, but just to make the point tonight, there's nothing here where the Buddha said, I did. I said it again. I'm not putting down Christianity, but just to make the point, the Buddha didn't find salvation from doing a series of somethings, and then it was bestowed on him, this understanding. He became rightly self-awakening by delving into and understanding what he wanted to understand, the nature of suffering. And so he never saw himself as a savior. He never tried to teach a salvific religion, and he never separated himself from humanity. He never set himself up as a god, did he? There's nothing in here, or in any of the other teachings of the Buddha, as recounted in the Sutta Pitaka, where he established himself as a god or superhuman in any way. And the significance of this sutta is just that, like you were saying. He's just talking about himself as a human being who figured it out, and then he left his teachings for us. If he can do it, we all can do it. And that's really how when I realized that, I realized that if in that way, that if he could do it and his teachings are here, I think I can do it. And it doesn't mean because I think I'm gifted in some way. I don't. I think I'm just the average person that's lived, an interesting life in some ways. But I can figure this out, and we all can. And I don't have to do it. The remarkable thing about the Buddha, about Siddhartha Gotama, is he didn't have anybody showing him the way, did he? But he did have people showing him the way that it wasn't. And that was important. Great class. Any other questions or comments? So we'll finish this sutta up next week, and I'm giving the same talk on Tuesdays too. So the second talk on Tuesday will be next Tuesday, and our second talk will be next Saturday. 2 announcements. I'm changing our schedule slightly. I will no longer, at least for the next couple of months, be giving the Wednesday video podcast, but I will be giving a Dhamma talk on Thursday night from home at 7:15. So there won't be a Thursday night class here for at least the next couple of months. So. And our Dana dinner is coming up November 20th. I think we have everything covered except maybe soft drinks and ice. So if anybody can get that, just let me know. And there's a donation box out there too that will.
What is the Dana dinner? What is the date?
Oh, November 20th, the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week.
Okay.
Yeah, we invited. I invite. In response to the Galassos fire, I invited the town council and the mayor, who's part of the council. He's coming, and at least a few of the council members are coming. I emailed the first responder, the fire departments, and the rescue squads. There were 17 of them, so if they come, we're going to have a lot of people, and the police department. So just as a community, it's a community dinner to show our appreciation, because it really is remarkable what they did. This town could have easily gone up, the whole town. These are old wooden structures, one attached to another, close to it. So it's remarkable what they did. And I think they should get a show of appreciation. So yeah, November 20th, Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. There's some info on the website, but we'll finish with Metta as we always do. So again, find your relaxed meditation posture and become mindful of your in-breath and your out-breath. And these are the Buddha's words on Metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for a wonderful class this morning. Peace.